Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, Pwn Phone, and Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. We're here to talk about the enterprise security news. I think I have an announcement, too. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe not. IT Pro TV? IT Pro TV is awesome. Why not, right? Matt, have you checked out IT Pro TV yet?
No, I've been too busy.
Yeah, we'll get you an evaluation, and I'm curious to get your take on it. I think more of us here at Security Weekly are going to be partaking in various on-demand trainings that they offer. itpro.tv/Security Weekly. You can start accessing it today. It's great training. You know, it helps supplement a lot of things. You know, I've got folks going through project management, other folks going through containers and Docker. So it's a great way to keep up with all the things that are constantly changing in the field today. So make sure you check them out, itpro.tv/Security Weekly. Matt, our first news article here today is about a CASB called Bitglass. It sounds like a story. Once upon a time, there was a CASB called Bitglass. Now, they do state, I think, pretty well, as far as, like, I understand how press releases and marketing materials get created, because once upon a time, I was responsible for creating some of those materials. And they say that the technology they're announcing, they're dubbing zero-day cloud app indexing with machine learning. And you're like, what is that? They actually do a pretty decent job just describing what that is. The technology automatically indexes and dynamically computes reputation ratings for known and unknown cloud applications using machine learning techniques. I'd say that's not bad about what they do. Now, they're missing kind of the problem statement, which is what I want to kind of drag out of Matt, is what's the problem we're trying to solve here?
Well, I think what they're trying to solve here is the shadow cloud application environment, right? New websites pop up all the time. New services are popping up all the time. And IT's trying to get their arms around who's using what, right? This whole concept of shadow IT has been out there for a while. So what I think they're trying to do is to say, look, if you're using our CASB and we see your users going to these new websites and using these applications, we'll start to identify them, profile them, and identify whether it's good or bad. And I think it's really for IT to say, look, you've got users out here that are using, you know, these new services. Do you want them using those services, or should they not be using them? So that's what I think they're trying to do with this press release.
Yeah. And it's not I could see, especially when we were, you know, just talking about companies over 100,000 employees, how do you do that? I don't know how well these solutions scale, but certainly you have to imagine if you've got a company of over 20,000 people, the amount of cloud services that they could be potentially accessing and using is staggering in a way to, even if the reputation rating is, you know, based on machine learning and not, 100% accurate, like how do you really know if it's reputable or not? But some measure of that, I would imagine, is helpful.
Yeah, and they're going to have to interface with some other services here probably to get some of that reputational data to do it. There's others that do this, by the way. I mean, they have an interesting position because they're a CASB and because you're, you know, sitting in the line of traffic, you can see that traffic. But there's other ways to do this as well. But it is, if you think about the root of the problem, it's trying to solve the shadow IT cloud access activities.
Sure. WhiteHat has announced it's combating code vulnerabilities with Sentinel Source for microservices. I thought the microservices aspect on this was, I think Matt and I pretty much labeled it as
the buzz term.
Yeah, labeled it as a buzz term. They say some really interesting things in here that it begs me to question them. They say since containers share the same OS, however, they also tend to be more vulnerable to security threats. I don't.
Well, it depends.
Yeah.
Well,
it's like, huh?
We can probably get into a little more of this detail in the next segment a little bit, but the term microservices is the buzzword here, because a microservice is really a grouping of containers that are performing a specific service for an application, right? And so they could have just as easily, and probably more rightfully so, said for containers, because what they're doing, from what I can gather, is doing static analysis of the containers that make up a microservice as part of a microservice architecture. That's what I gathered out of the release. And in that light, it's going to be similar to what other static analysis tools are doing, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's Veracode or Fortify or others that are now starting to move into analyzing and doing static analysis of the containers. It's the term microservices here that's like, wait a minute, where's that microservice? It's kind of hard to static scan a microservice because it could be a few components or a few containers that are in there.
Right.
So that's why I didn't like that term. Anyways.
Yeah, but it's weird. They say,
yeah, but to the other point,
with this technology, service providers can deploy multiple applications on a single host operating system, and since they share the same OS, however, they also tend to be more vulnerable to. I don't understand how they're more vulnerable to security threats. I think that's the piece we're calling into question.
Yeah. There could be components, right? So it's better now than it was in the early days, mm-hmm. but the configuration of the container environment is critical when you use containers, because they do need some underlying access to the operating system. What I've traditionally seen is the way most people have tried to address container security is through either a kernel or host plugin that has root credentials. Mm-hmm. And in those environments, there could be some susceptibility, right? Depending on how those are protected. But I think most of the DevOps teams are better at configuring a lot of the initial configuration components to not provide root access into the host anymore.
But that's configuration.
I think that's what they're hinting to.
And they're also talking about static source code analysis as it applies to this environment as well. And it says what makes their solution unique is the ability to provide nearly no false positives when scanning code, which that's a pretty bold claim. I mean,
pretty bold term.
Yeah,
bold
and
statement.
like, what's nearly mean? That's a very non-specific measure.
Less than 1%.
Nearly, yeah. Like, what's nearly? I don't know.
Static analysis has its challenges still, but I mean,
yeah,
it's just one piece of a overall application security program. Static is one, but there's other pieces, because static doesn't understand what the app's doing at runtime, because you're
just looking at code.
The code. Yeah.
Has static analysis really changed given containers? I mean, you're still running code that's getting analyzed. I think when we talk about third-party components, certainly it's kind of interesting, and that's a whole different vertical, in my opinion.
And with containers, you have all the binaries and different software libraries that are dependencies to what's in the container. And so understanding what those binaries and libraries are, whether they're vulnerable or not, is definitely useful. But again, it's only one piece of the overall equation.
Right. So is this really just static analysis?
That's the way I read it.
Okay.
It's a new static analysis capability of containers to support your microservices-based architecture.
And it sounds more like they use the term innovative licensing model. I think they've changed their licensing model to make it more applicable to a container environment, which makes sense, because that, depending on how you're licensing it, well, Matt and I have had a lot of conversations about how you package and license things in the past. That would need to change, right? Because I look at how even my own small development environment has changed. Like, we had one code repository, and then we put it in production. But now with containers, right, there's development, there's staging and QA, and there's production, and there's 3 different containers. And how you license that could certainly impact. Yeah, so they're making it easier.
Yeah, and you can look at it a couple different ways. You can look at it by the image itself, or the registry, which is where all the images are stored.
Right.
But then you got to think about the runtime side, which are instances, right? The running instance of an image, right? The container itself and running production is different, right? So you have to account for those differences in your licensing and pricing models, because they're measured differently. A customer that has 10 container images could be running 1 million containers in production, right? If they scale that big, right? So, those numbers they're not equal across those. So you have to account for those in
I think
licensing and pricing.
Even just one small application, how many instances I have today versus before I put it in microservices, like there's all kinds of images in the registry. Developers have, a set of images. So yeah, I can certainly see that being an issue.
Yep.
This next article, VMwares NSX, Coalfire has done some analysis of it and is talking about its ability to deliver a DMZ anywhere. I'm really calling into question the usage of this term DMZ, because I think it's legacy and really doesn't apply. I mean, they're really just segments, and we talk about containers and microservices. I think DMZ is a legacy term, no?
Yeah, I think what they're pointing to is microsegmentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ability to segment the networks down into smaller pieces. What we would have called a DMZ back in the day when we had a single or a couple ingress-egress points in microservice-based architecture and where containers are going, there's a lot more potential network segments or network communication paths. And so microsegmentation gives you the ability to isolate pieces of that. So I think that's what this is, but just using the old DMZ term. A little legacy there, but that's the way I read it, was more, hey, using my VMware environment and using software-defined networking, I can do better microsegmentation of my application environment.
Now, NSX, does that support containers? Or are we still talking about an NSX, like virtual machines moving around?
So VMware announced some new app defense products late last year, and I'm not sure how they compare to NSX, whether they're add-ons to NSX or they're separate products. I haven't dug in that deep into VMware lately. But VMware has been working on like Photon OS for container environments, the app defense products. So they're definitely taking the container side seriously, but I don't know where NSX stops and some of these new container pieces begin. So I would see this probably more at the virtual machine layer, because that's where NSX has traditionally been, but it could be at a slightly different spot in the VMware ecosystem.
And this was an article from last week. Of course, we talked about Twistlock and how they have now serverless support. And we kind of picked on that a little bit. But what's your take on what Twistlock has just announced? And we'll focus it on that before we move into the next segment, or I want a more generalized overview of the container security market. But
yeah, so there were a couple announcements in this release, and the term serverless is the one that everybody kind of pinpointed, because when you read the article from Daniel Meyer through SDX Central, it talks specifically about static analysis of the serverless environment. And to me, doing a static analysis in serverless is completely different than doing runtime in serverless, right? And part of it is because the way most container security companies have approached security has been either through privileged security containers, which requires root access to the host, or a kernel plugin, which also requires access to the host. Well, in serverless computing, you don't have access to the host. So if you dig in here a little bit, you start to realize that I don't think they announced they can support runtime capabilities on serverless, but they can support static capabilities on serverless. That's the way I read it through the SDX article. Mm-hmm. It's a little harder in the eWeek article to discern that.
Yeah.
Then they talked about their container native application firewall, which again is kind of microsegmentation, right? Because they're firewalling between areas. So that's kind of what they announced in the release in a nutshell. But serverless is kind of it's a hard claim, I think.
And
I think it's going to be.
Even the term firewall is really not applicable here either. It's
No.
more of that like DMZ legacy term that they're using because people understand when you say firewall, generally what you're talking about. But if you think about a microservices or container-based environment, there are networking style components that would be applicable to the term firewall, but there's also trust in file systems. There's trust in file systems and storage. There's trust between containers that are sort of like networking. Like there's a lot of different areas of trust that extend, I think, beyond what the term firewall can really describe.
And this is why I think there's a little bit of a challenge in the container security space, which we'll probably talk about a little more in the next segment, is the early vendors tried to take old traditional security approaches and try to apply them to containers. And what's happening in the container market and where the infrastructures are going is really going to limit some of those solutions because those approaches don't work going forward. When we think about things as serverless computing or function as a service, when you don't have access to the underlying hosts anymore, even container as a service, in a shared container as a service offering, whether it's GKS or EKS or ECS, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have the ability to install a kernel plugin or run a privileged agent in the environment. So what's the longevity of some of these solutions? To me, you need to rethink containers a little differently, which is kind of where we're starting to see some of these new emerging technologies take off. But then because they're applying old approaches, they're also applying old terms.
Yes. Yep, makes perfect sense. All right, let's do this. Let's take a short break, come back, and take a step back and talk about container security in a little more depth. Stay tuned.